Iranian assistance to Assad was running at $1 billion a month. People know that in Iran, and they know now that the whole thing has been for nothing. So it is very dangerous, I think, for the rulers of Iran.
Coming up, if there is worry about which groups, like ISIS, could benefit from all this upheaval in Syria, what should the West be doing? What are they already doing? If I were Donald Trump, I would be saying, as he has been saying on Truth Social, I want nothing to do with this. It's nothing to do with us. Let them just sort it out amongst themselves. But of course, the US, the UK, other Western governments will be worried about, in this maybe ungoverned space, even if there is a bit of a stasis between these groups and not an all-out war between all of them, the worry about something like ISIS re-emerging and getting a better foothold, or even some of those ISIS fighters and former fighters and families who are in those camps in Syria somehow making their way back to Europe in some instances and exporting that terrorism. How big a concern is that?
Yeah, absolutely. Luke, you channeling Donald Trump was not on my bingo card for this morning.
I didn't do the voice.
No, but let's unpack that because it's really important. I mean, firstly, you've got some actual simple procedural issues, even if Trump or the UK government would ever wanted to lean in more, about HTS being prescribed as a terrorist organisation, about Giuliani having a 10 million US bounty on his head as a terrorist. So even just talking to them, State Department or CIA or whatever, is potentially problematic.
And on Monday morning, we had Pat McFadden, the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster, sort of de facto Deputy Prime Minister, suggesting that might be looked at. Now they are
US and UK have both implied, well, it's going to get in the way of helping people and doing stuff. So then you've got this question of, well, does Al-Qaeda or the Islamic State or whoever, these residual militant jihadist forces, try to take advantage of this situation? Now, what we saw yesterday was a lot of bombing by aircraft going on, and bizarrely, two different sets of aircraft from two different countries bombing for different reasons, both trying to take this moment of this state of flux, this pivot point between the old system and the new, to take advantage to try and prevent dangers as they see them from materializing. So the Americans hit 75 targets, mainly across the east of Syria, where they believe Islamic State groups were held up and maybe forming up in the pickup trucks or whatever to go off and try and seize land. So the Americans hit lots of them. I mean, that's a large scale of American military action compared to, what we'd seen, for example, over the last 14 months since October the 7th. Whether it's Islamic State, whether it's HTS, whether it's Hezbollah, it's a state of flux. Yeah.
Thinking about the ISIS dynamic, though, in a press release about that bombing campaign that you mentioned that happened at the end of the weekend, the US said that they were doing it in order to prevent ISIS from conducting external operations and to ensure that ISIS does not seek to take advantage of the current situation to reconstitute in central Syria. We haven't heard really in the mainstream media about ISIS for absolutely ages. Is it still, well, maybe just before all the events of the last few weeks, any kind of a threat? And what are the fears about what it could actually genuinely grow into and maybe export?
I think it's very hard to say. I mean, ISIS clearly had been ground down by the campaign that the US-led coalition had fought against it. It may be they've got a few thousand fighters now. They are weak, but the question is, in a state of flux, do they have various possibilities? Do they lay their hands on a lot more weaponry? Do we find a month or two down the line that there are political tensions, as there have been in the past, between HTS and some of the other militant Sunni groups, that maybe people start to drift away from HTS? Maybe ISIS starts to grow again. So those are the kind of things that America will be worried about and American intelligence will be worried about. And similarly, the Israelis will be worried that some group in Syria decides they're going to stand out from the crowd, as it were, by launching attacks across the Syrian border. And the Americans will have their agendas related to Islamic State.
There are these camps, sprawling camps in Syria, where lots of these sort of foreign, former ISIS fighters still are.
Al-Hul is the big,
Save the Children says there are more than 60 British children amongst them. So that gives you a sense of the similar scale.
Exactly. This is a camp called Al-Hul, but it is in the area controlled by the SDF, which is this American-led, Kurdish-dominated security force. And Trump had said, I'm going to take the American troops out as soon as I can. There's only just under 1,000 there. And already various people in Congress are saying, whoa, maybe not the best time to remove America from this picture. I think highly likely that, notwithstanding Trump posting on social media that he's not going to get involved, I think keeping that American footprint there will be very useful precisely to stop.
Some suit will get to him once he's in office and say, if you do this.
The deep state.
Yeah, the deep state will come and put a hand on his shoulder and say,
Mr. President, we cannot let those hundreds of ISIS supporters that are still in places like Al-Hul camp, we can't risk them getting away. And, as we know, because of what happened to Hezbollah in Lebanon and how that then had this effect of undermining the whole Assad regime in Syria, even quite small changes in terms of 1,000 troops here or a few thousand there can upset the delicate balance in parts of Syria. So, there'll be a lot of pressure on the US to keep that contingent there. It's not a big military commitment.
Zooming out, what has this done to the much broader picture and the axis of resistance? If you think about Iran and what's happened to its strategic partners in not just Syria, but also in Lebanon as well. Hezbollah was so weakened by what Israel's done to it that it couldn't come to Assad's rescue. Assad's departure from Syria mean that some of Iran's forward bases there and Russia's bases there are not yet necessarily at their disposal. Hamas in Gaza, obviously much weakened. Are we seeing an enormous shift? Are we seeing a chapter end and a new chapter start? Amidst all of this?
Well, it's an inflection point, that's for sure. 54 years of Assad regime brutality. At least, though, that was a constant in the calculations of the different regional actors. Now, as we've been talking about this state of flux, this state of unknown, people in the Middle East really don't like that. And I think it creates all sorts of possibilities and people will want to exploit it. I think another question concerns Iran itself. There are economic problems, there's strong opposition, and there's a population at large that sees the humiliation of the militant factions in Iran, the people who've been behind the Assad project being humiliated. That's dangerous, I think, for Ayatollah Khamenei and the people on that side of politics in Iran.
There's also a lesson for them, isn't there, that unpopular autocratic states can fail and fall a lot quicker than maybe you were expecting. If you're Khamenei or whoever in Iran, are you looking at what's happening in Syria and thinking...
That comes back to the kind of, like some people say about bankruptcy, little by little, then all of a sudden. Yeah. So it comes back to the nature of power in those countries. It is vital for power to be maintained for rulers in that situation in the Middle East to have the image of people who can use violence effectively and successfully, whether that's the violence of the dungeon, the torture chamber that we see being liberated now in Syria, or whether it's the use of aircraft dropping bombs, shock troops going in to retake suburbs of Aleppo, or the things we saw in the Civil War. You have to be seen to be effective. And what's happened in Iran is the Israelis have successfully done things to them like taking down their whole air defense in one night and then hitting lots of key targets. Hezbollah, the jewel in the crown of the so-called axis of resistance, the Iranian-led militant forces across the region, has taken severe blows. And Assad, I think even more importantly, thousands of Iranians died propping up Assad. I don't know if you've ever seen these videos of chants at football games and things about, don't send our money to Syria and don't send our money to Hamas and don't send. So there's a lot of popular anger with the Axis of Resistance project because a lot of Iranians facing economic hardship feel that billions. I mean, at one stage in the Syrian civil war, it was reckoned that Iranian assistance to Assad was running at $1 billion a month. People know that in Iran, and they know now that the whole thing has been for nothing. So it is very dangerous, I think, for the rulers of Iran.
That's The Story from The Times and The Sunday Times. Listen and follow wherever you get your podcasts.